6/7. So we've been out of school for a while, so I'm thinking that some of you may be having a little bit of trouble with some of our fraction work. So I'm going to try and go through a few bits of it and see if we can't help you out a little bit. I'm going to be covering some of the work in the fractions, decimals, and percents review. It is the Google Slides that I posted this morning with the blue front cover. There were two, one for 6s and one for 6s and 7s. And so this is for the 6s and the 7s as a review. But since we did this back in March, it could use a bit of a refresher. So the first one's asking me to find equivalent fractions. And I have an unknown. I don't know what this number is in my fraction. So I have to stick with the main rule in fractions, which is what I do to the top, I must do to the bottom. So if I look at this right here, what did I do to go from 4 to a 1? When we're talking about finding equivalent fractions, we're always talking about either multiplying or dividing. Because the number got smaller, I did division. So I know that 4 divided by 4 equals 1. Anything by itself equals 1. So the top I divided by 4. So in order to find my unknown number, I need to do the same thing to the bottom. So I'm going to take 12 divided by 4, and I can either use a calculator, I can use a multiplication chart, or I just might know that 12 divided by 4 is in fact 3. And there's my equivalent fraction. Let's look at the example down here at the bottom. The same thing sort of applies. I need to figure out what I did to the top so I can do the same thing to the bottom. So I'm going to look here and I'm going to think, how did I go from 30 to 5? Well, I know that the number got smaller, so I divided. I can look on a multiplication chart, a division chart, or I can use the calculator. And I realized that I did a divide by 6. So on this side, on the bottom, I need to also divide by 6. So now it means that something divided by 6 equals 6. Let me see if you can get that in so I can see that. Something divided by 6 equals 6. But I need to figure out what that something is. If I take 6 times 6, which is the opposite of the division, I'm going to get 36. And therefore I know that my blank here is going to be 36. And now I have an equivalent fraction. The key part to this is what I do to the top, I need to do to the bottom. I need to figure out what did they do on either top or the bottom and do the same thing to the next fraction. All right, the next part was about making fractions to a denominator of 100, because we really need to do that really well to help us with the decimals and the percents. So my example was 1/4. So if I look at 1/4, I need to figure out what do I have to do to get that to a bottom of 100. 4 times something is going to get me 100. If I do division and I switch the equation around and make 100 divided by 4, that's going to get me 25. And that's the number that I'm going to put here. Because my number is getting bigger, I'm going to multiply. What I do to the bottom, I need to do to the top. So if 4 times 25 equals 100, then I'm going to multiply the top also by 25 to get myself my equivalent fraction with a base now of 100. So let's do the next example here. The next example on the question is 6/10. I want to get that to a base of 100. So I need to figure out, what do I do along the bottom to go from 10 to 100? Well, it's obviously getting bigger, so I need to multiply. And I know that 10 times 10 is 100. What I do to the bottom, I need to do to the top. So I'm going to choose the top by 10. 6 times 10 equals 60. And there's my equivalent fraction with a denominator over 100. I think that the next screen is some more practice of that. So let's do one more example. Let's choose 2/5. So our next example is 2/5. And I want to get that to a denominator of 100. So I need to be thinking in my head, 5 times what gets me 100? If I do 100 divided by 5, turn the equation around, that will get me the number I'm looking for. The answer is 20. So if I do 5 times 20 gets me 100, what I do to the bottom of the fraction, I need to do to the top. So I'm going to times this by 20, and my new fraction is going to be 40. And this is really important to get these fractions to a denominator of 100, because then I can very easily turn them into decimals. The page 5 is a really helpful page if you get stuck on what am I multiplying by? The 5 times 20, how did I know it was 20? The page 5 on the screen will actually help you a lot figure that out. The information's right there. Okay, now we want to reduce to lowest terms. So reducing to lowest terms means taking the fraction, finding an equivalent fraction, which is the same but with smaller numbers, then putting it over a number over 100, then putting into a percent. So that's kind of a lot to do. So let's go with my example here. The example was 12/15. So my little grade 6-7 brain should be going off, and I should know that both of those numbers can be divided by 3. If I'm not really sure about that, I can look across a multiplication chart until I find a row where both the 12 and the 15 are located. And in this case, they're both located on the 3 multiplication chart. So then I do the math to reduce it. 12 divided by 3 equals 4. 15 divided by 3 equals 5. Now I have it down to I have reduced my fraction in such a way that I know now that I can get to something over 100, which is just what we finished practicing. So now we're going to do 5 times something gets me out to a number out of 100. If you look on page 5 of the slides, it will give you that exact piece. And I know that I need to multiply by 20. So I'm going to multiply the top by 20, and that gets me to 80. Now, as I said before, 80 out of 100 is a really easy way to turn this into a decimal. So if I have my fraction of 80 over 100, and I want to turn that into a decimal, I just do this. Notice what I've done. I've taken off the fraction part of it, and I've put in a decimal to show that it is less than 1. Now, if I want to turn that into a percent, I take the number, and I take off the decimal, and it turns into a percent. I'm actually multiplying it by 100, but I'm content if you do it that way. So let's try the next example on that page. The next example was 20 out of 40. 20 over 40. So the first thing I want to do is reduce that to a smaller but equal fraction. I know that both of those numbers I can divide by 10. Get my new fraction is 2/4. Fourths, I should know, is a number that I can turn into something over 100. So let's do that, because we just finished practicing that. So now I need to think about 4 times something is going to get me close to 100. Well, that would be 4 times 25, because it's like quarters in your hand with money. 25, 50, 75, 100. What I do to the bottom, I need to do to the top. So I'm going to times the top by 25. I now have 50 over 100. As soon as I have a fraction over 100, I can very easily turn that into a decimal. So let's rewrite the fraction over here. I want to turn that into a decimal. Notice how easy that is. And now I want to turn that into a percent. Notice how easy that is. And then we've got it. We've narrowed it down. Okay, so there's a couple pages of practicing. The next skill it wants you to do is comparing decimals and percents using the signs of inequality. So it shows 2/5. I'll do the first example. And it shows 32%. Okay? And in this space, they want me to put either greater than, less than, or equal to. But I can't compare fractions and percents. It just doesn't work. So I'm going to want to turn this, it's easier to turn this fraction into a percent, and then I can compare. So we've done this practice, so let's do it down here to show our work. So 2/5, I want to turn it into something over 100. And I know that fifths works really well because on page 5 it gives me that little cheat sheet. So if I know it's 5 times 20 gets me 100, what I do to the bottom, I need to do to the top, which gets me 40 out of 100. I can turn that into a decimal, and I can turn that into a percent. So now all of a sudden I have 2%. This side showed me 32%. This 2/5 is actually 40%. Therefore, if I was to compare them, 40% is bigger. So I'm going to draw the alligator mouth pointing to the bigger number. Let's try the next one on that page. All right, the next question is 11/20 compared to 60%. Okay, and we need to know which is bigger. Again, the percent is already in a nice easy spot, so let's change the fraction to a percent. So we're going to change 11/20 into something over 100. If I look on page 5 of my handy cheat sheet, it shows me that 20 times 5 gets me something over 100. So now I can do 11 times 5 on the top to get me 55 over 100. I can now take this really easy fraction and I can turn it into a decimal, and I can turn it into a percent. Okay, so now this 11/20 actually has the same value as 55%. So now I can compare my 2%. I can compare 55 on this side and 60% on this side. 60% is clearly bigger, so I'm going to make my alligator mouth eating the bigger number. Okay, and let's see what's next. The last page wants you to write 3 different fractions that are equivalent to. So I've given you a decimal, and you need to write an equivalent fraction. So 0.5, I know, is equivalent to 1/2. That's just something that we kind of need to learn and memorize. Well, if I know that 0.5 is the same as 1/2, remember our rule from the beginning, what you do to the top, you got to do to the bottom. If I times the top by 3 and the bottom by 3, I will get an equivalent fraction of 3/6. If I go to back to my half, and I times the top by 10 and the bottom by 10, I can get myself a new equivalent fraction. And so I need to do this 3 times so that I have my original decimal, and now I have 1 equal fraction, 2 equal fractions, and 3 equal fractions. When I have a number like 0.2 as my number, I can make that a fraction like that, which becomes 2/10. Then I can do the same thing. I can multiply the top and the bottom by any number. Let's go 3, and I can make an equivalent fraction. And I can do that over and over again to get the same kind of fraction. The last one asks you to write each set of numbers in order from smallest to biggest. And so what you need to do is you need to bring them all to the same thing, either all to fractions, all to decimals, or all to percents. And so the decimal is actually kind of that in-between stage. So I would suggest you bring them all to decimals. The question is 3/5, 42%, and 0.73. Okay? So I want to bring them all to decimals because that's going to be my easy thing. This one is already a decimal. Check. 42%, in order to turn it into a decimal, I just take off the percent sign, I add my 0 point, and I get my 42. It is now in a decimal. Check. So now I'm left with the fraction. So what I need to do is bring it to a denominator of 100. So let's do some math down here. 3/5 equals something over 100. I know, after lots of practice, that that's times 20. What I do to the bottom, I need to do to the top. So now I multiply 3 times 20 and I have 60. So my new equivalent fraction is 60 over 100. To turn that into a decimal, I have 0.6, which also equals 0.60. I can add zeros at the end of the number and it doesn't affect the value. So now I have this number. 3/5 is now in a decimal. It is 0.60. The question asks you to show the numbers, therefore, from least to greatest. So in fact, 42% is 0.42, so that's the smallest of our numbers. Sorry, I'm just trying to get you to see the last bit. 42% is the smallest. Then comes our 3/5, which is 60%, and comes 0.73 is last. And we should be able to put those 3 numbers in order now from smallest to biggest. I hope this video has helped you a little bit. I will post it up on YouTube, and I will work on showing you the next video in our series. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.